Welcome back to the channel and to part two of my review on the 100 Years War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017 by Professor Rashid Khalidi. My first part of this was from 1917 until 1967, and this is going to cover the period from 1982 through 2014, again using Professor Khalidi's frame, which I shared in the first video, which you don't have to have watched before you watch this, but if you'd like to, you can. There'll be a link to it in the description below, in which he talks about 6 different wars on the Palestinians. And so I talked about the first 3, and the 1917 Balfour Declaration, the 1948 war, and of course the 1967 war as well. So here I'm going to be talking about 1982, 1987 to 1995, First Intifada, and then 2000 to 2014 with the various wars on Gaza. And I suppose without further ado, I can get started and start sharing with you what Professor Khalidi had to say. In spite of this firestorm, and even with Israel's extensive aerial surveillance capabilities and its many hundreds of agents and spies planted in Lebanon, the war took place before the age of the reconnaissance drone. Not one of the PLO's several functioning underground command and control posts or its multiple communication centers was ever hit. Nor was a single PLO leader killed in the attacks, although many civilians died when the Israeli Air Force missed its targets. This is surprising given just how extensive were Israel's efforts to liquidate them. Israel's leaders were clearly unconcerned about killing civilians trying to do so. After an air attack in July 1981 destroyed a building in Beirut with heavy civilian casualties, Begin's office had stated that, quote, Israel was no longer refraining from attacking guerrilla targets in civilian areas, unquote. Arafat himself was a prime target. In an August 5 letter to Ronald Reagan, Begin wrote that these days he felt as if he and his valiant army were facing Berlin, where amongst innocent civilians, Hitler and his henchmen hide in a bunker deep beneath the surface. Begin often drew such parallels between Arafat and Hitler. If Arafat was another Hitler, then killing him was certainly permissible and justified, whatever the cost in civilian lives. Toward the end of the siege, on August the 6th, I was near a half-finished 8-story apartment building a few blocks from where we lived when a precision-guided munition demolished it. I had stopped to drop off a friend at his parked car not far from the building. I had almost reached home as planes swooped down, and I heard a huge explosion behind me. Later, I saw that the entire building was flattened, pancaked into a single mound of smoking rubble. The structure, which had been full of Palestinian refugees from Sabra and Shatila, had reportedly just been visited by Arafat. At least 100 people, probably more, were killed, most of them women and children. Days later, my friend told me that immediately after the air attack, just as he got into his car, shaken but unhurt, a car bomb exploded nearby, presumably having been set to kill the rescuers who were helping families trying to find their loved ones in the rubble. Such car bombs, a weapon of choice for the Israeli forces besieging Beirut, and one of their most terrifying instruments of death and destruction, were described by one Mossad officer as killing for killing's sake. There is a vital thread of U.S. responsibility that must be followed to understand what happened next. The consequences were not just the results of decisions by Sharon, Begin, and other Israeli leaders, or of the actions of Lebanese militias who were Israel's allies. They were also the direct responsibility of the Reagan administration, which, under pressure from Israel, stubbornly refused to accept the need for any formal safeguards for civilians, rejected the provision of international guarantees, and blocked the long-term deployment of international forces that might have protected non-combatants. Instead, to secure the PLO's evacuation, Philip Habib, operating via Lebanese intermediaries, provided the Palestinians with solemn, categorical written pledges to shield the civilians in the refugee camps and neighborhoods of West Beirut. Typed on plain paper without letterhead, signatures, or identification, these memos were transmitted to the PLO by Lebanese Prime Minister Shafiq al-Wazan and later enshrined in the records of the Lebanese government. So, they don't want to protect civilians. The U.S. has never cared about protecting civilians, and particularly not Palestinian civilians, and in this case as well, Lebanese civilians. The following evening, two shaken American journalists, Lauren Jenkins and Jonathan Randall of the Washington Post, among the first Westerners to enter the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, came to tell us what they had seen. They had been with Ryan Crocker, who was the first American diplomat to file a report on what the three of them had witnessed, the hideous evidence of a massacre. Throughout the previous night, we learned the flares fired by the Israeli army had illuminated the camps for the LF militias, whom it had sent there to mop up as they slaughtered defenseless civilians. The LF militia is unfortunately a Maronite terrorist organization, effectively. Between September the 16th and the morning of September the 18th, the militiamen murdered more than 1,300 Palestinian and Lebanese men, women, and children. The statement is as true of the war as a whole as it is of the massacres in Sabra and Shatila. This statement. In his mind, the murderers and the circles around them were one and the same. So it doesn't matter if you were the person pulling the trigger or you're the people protecting the people who are pulling the trigger. So he says the statement is as true of the war as a whole as it is of the massacres in Sabra and Shatila. A commission of inquiry set up after the events, chaired by Israeli Supreme Court Justice Yitzhak Kahan, established the direct and indirect responsibility of Begin, Sharon, and senior Israeli military commanders for the massacres. Most of those named lost their posts as a result of both the inquiry and the general revulsion in Israel over the massacres. However, documents released by the Israel State Archives in 2012 and the unpublished secret appendices to the Kahan Commission reveal even more damning evidence of these individuals' culpability, which was far greater than the original 1983 report lays out. The documents expose long deliberated decisions by Sharon and others to send the practiced phalangist killers into the Palestinian refugee camps with the aim of massacring and driving away their populations. They also show how American diplomats were repeatedly browbeaten by their Israeli interlocutors and failed to stop the slaughter that the U.S. government had promised to prevent. So at some point, the American intelligence services actually challenged the Israeli narrative. The documents show that U.S. officials had difficulty standing up to the Israelis over anything to do with their occupation of West Beirut. When Moshe Arens, Israel's ambassador in Washington, was obliged to listen to a series of harsh talking points read to him that were drafted by Secretary of State George Shultz, accusing Israel of deception and demanding the immediate withdrawal of its troops from West Beirut, Arens responded with scorn. "I'm not sure you guys know what you are doing," he told Lawrence Eagleburger, the Deputy Secretary of State, and called the American points a fabrication and completely false. Eagleburger suggested that the State Department might issue a statement calling Israel's occupation of West Beirut contrary to assurances, at which point Arens's deputy, the 33-year-old Benjamin Netanyahu, weighed in. "I would suggest you delete this," he said. "Otherwise, you give us no choice but to defend our credibility by setting the record straight. We'll end up in a shooting war with each other." After listening to an aside from Netanyahu in Hebrew, Arens added, "I think that is right. Rarely in history has a junior diplomat of a small country spoken thus to a senior representative of a superpower, and been supported in doing so." Sharon characteristically escalated things. This is a few weeks later. Sharon characteristically escalated things. "There are thousands of terrorists in Beirut," he told Draper. This is Ambassador Morris Draper, by the way, ambassador from the U.S. to Israel. "Is it your interest that they will stay here?" Draper did not demur at this false assertion. But when the exasperated U.S. envoy said to the assembled Israeli officials, "We didn't think you should have come into West Beirut. You should have stayed out," Sharon bluntly told the ambassador, "You did not think, or you did think. When it comes to our security, we have never asked. We will never ask. When it comes to existence and security, it is our own responsibility, and we will never give it to anybody to decide for us." That is the Likud line from 1982 to 2024. We will not answer to anyone. We are superior to everyone, and we'll take your money, but we won't take your advice. So moving on, the Fifth Declaration of War, 1987 to 1995. Remember that the First Intifada breaks out in December of 1987. And if you don't know what an Intifada is, the Palestinians didn't know what it was either at the time. It was just a spontaneous outburst of frustration, which just was from one event. I think an Israeli military vehicle hit a truck with 4 Palestinians in it. They were killed. But in any case, it was just one small event that led to a really nonviolent demonstration, and where the real power was. We've seen that power of nonviolent protest. And it really took the Israelis by surprise. As I say, I think it took the Palestinians by surprise as well. But frustration has to come out somewhere. And in this case, it came out in many ways nonviolently. And it managed to engage a lot of the Palestinian population, some of the educated, the children. It wasn't just the young militant Fedayeen anymore. It was everyone in Palestine was united on pushing back against the occupier. After a month of escalating unrest in January 1988, Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin ordered the security forces to use force, might, and beatings. His iron fist policy was carried out through the explicit practice of breaking the demonstrators' arms and legs and cracking their skulls, as well as beating others who aroused the soldiers' ire. Within a short time, widely televised images of heavily armed soldiers brutalizing teenage Palestinian protesters created a major media backlash in the United States and elsewhere, showing Israel in its true light as a callous occupying power. Only 5 years after the media coverage of the siege and bombing of Beirut, this exposure dealt another blow to the image of a country largely dependent on complacent American public opinion. And I'm saying this, and I'm reading this in April of 2024, where many of you will have watched teenage Palestinian, say pro-Palestinian protesters on American university campuses being beaten, some of them having their arms and legs broken, some having their skulls cracked. And it's no different than what was happening here in 1988, although this time, obviously, it's with people who are probably at least not going to be beaten in prisons as the Palestinians would be after they get arrested. A lot of these college students are probably going to get released, and then they're going to sue the police. And in America, when you sue the police, you usually win. So it's going to work out badly for the police in the United States who did this. From the beginning of the First Intifada to the end of 1996, 9 years, including 6 when the Intifada was ongoing, Israeli troops and armed settlers killed 1,422 Palestinians, almost one every other day. Of them, 294, or over 20%, were minors, 16 and under. 175 Israelis, 86 of them security personnel, were killed by Palestinians during the same period. That 8-to-1 casualty ratio was typical, something one would not have known from much of the American media coverage. And it's the same today. It's always disproportionate. And for them, it also makes sense because Israelis are superior. They're a superior race. Palestinians are animals. And so if 100 Palestinians die in relation to one Israeli, they think that's about right. But probably it should be like 1,000. The failure to take advantage of the Palestinian presence at the UN amounted to willfully ignoring the people, the elites, and the media of the greatest power on earth and the mainstay of Israel, an approach that dated back to 1948 and before. As I saw in 1984, Arafat gave more importance to meeting the leader of a minor PLO faction linked to Iraq than to listening to expert advice about swaying public opinion in the United States. The situation had not improved since then. A simplistic view of the structures of government and decision-making in Washington led the PLO to pin all its hopes on winning the U.S. government's recognition as a legitimate Palestinian interlocutor. American good offices for a fair deal with the Israelis would surely follow. This attitude carried a trace of the naive faith of earlier generations of Palestinian leaders, shared by many Arab rulers to this day, that a personal appeal to a British colonial secretary or prime minister, a U.S. secretary of state or president, could solve the problem. This illusory view of the personal element in power relations may have been grounded in the experience of dealing with mercurial, all-powerful dictators and absolute monarchs in the Arab world. And to a certain extent, it works in other parts of the world with different forms of government. So, for example, with President Assad in Syria, he's been in power many years. President Putin, he had an interruption when Medvedev was president for a while, but he still was in power. So he's been in power for many years, President Xi in China. So you have places in the world in which you do have someone who you can build a relationship over many years with. But in most of the rest of the world, it's not important to build a relationship with a secretary of state or president who will be here 1 minute and gone the next. What you have to do, as Professor Khalidi was doing, is change public opinion. And you do that by giving talks, publishing books, doing art exhibitions, movies, films, all sorts of other ways to educate people so they understand where the problem is, and then they can push for change. But you're not going to have a relationship with one president and then hope that'll change. And as we'll see later with Obama, you can talk the talk, but as it turns out, the president's not that powerful. Obama famously said he was going to close Guantanamo, and he did close Guantanamo because, as Putin has said many times, the president of the United States is not really in charge of America. The men in the dark blue suits who tell the president what to do, they're the ones who are in power. Added to the fact that the United States could never be an honest broker given the commitments it had undertaken, Israel also had its own independent positions. Thus, any concessions made by the PLO to the United States did not necessarily bind Israel or make it more willing to deal with the organization. In fact, when at the end of the Reagan administration, the United States finally began a dialogue with the PLO following its 1988 declaration, Israel became even more intransigent. The obstacles posed by Israel were of a completely different nature. When Shamir was prime minister, there was constant squabbling over procedure and a painful dialogue of the deaf as far as substance was concerned. In particular, Israel was wedded to Begin's vision, enunciated at Camp David in 1978, of autonomy for the people, but not the land. So, in a sense, Palestinians could become permanent residents, but they could never become citizens. And certainly, if they were going to become citizens, it wasn't going to be of their own Palestinian polity. This was in keeping with the Israeli rights view, indeed the core of the Zionist doctrine, that only one people, the Jewish people, had a legitimate right to existence and sovereignty in the entirety of the land, which was called Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, not Palestine. The Palestinians were at best interlopers. In practice, this meant that when the Palestinians argued for broad legal and territorial jurisdiction for the future self-governing authority, they were met with a firm refusal from Israeli negotiators. Similarly, there was a refusal to limit settlement activity in any way. This was not surprising. Famously, Shamir was reported as saying that he would have dragged out the talks for 10 more years, while vastly increasing the number of Jewish settlers in Israeli-occupied territory. Are you starting to see the game that they play? While Rabin had done something no other Israeli leader had ever done by formally conceding that there was a Palestinian people, accepting the PLO as their representative, and opening negotiations with it, obtaining in return its recognition of the State of Israel, this exchange was neither symmetrical nor reciprocal. Israel had not recognized a Palestinian state, or even made a commitment to allow the creation of one. This was a peculiar transaction, whereby a national liberation movement had obtained nominal recognition from its oppressors, without achieving liberation, by trading its own recognition of the state that had colonized its homeland and continued to occupy it. This was a resounding, historic mistake, one with grave consequences for the Palestinian people. And as I alluded to in part one of this book review, in my last video, at this point in the book, I don't want to say you get more and more depressed. It's harder to read because you know it's only going to get worse from here. And we want it to get better for the Palestinians, obviously. So now if we're getting to 2000s and with Gaza, we're talking about the rise of Hamas. And since this is a survey book and it's not a specialty book talking about Hamas, we can maybe talk about that in a different review. The broad strokes are that Hamas was effectively funded by Israel, who wanted to have lots of different factions who are fighting with each other in Palestine. They didn't want to have one unified Palestine rising. They wanted to have lots of little factions. And before Hamas took the form that we know of it today as a militant Islamist group, it was an Islamic charity. And it helped people out with hospitals, schools. It still does that to this day, but it has obviously a more militant charter. But it was funded by the Israelis. Hamas was generously funded by the Israelis. That's a different discussion for a different time. So let's keep going with Professor Khalidi. Because of its utility to the occupation and splitting the Palestinian national movement, Israeli indulgence of the Brotherhood was extended to Hamas, notwithstanding its uncompromising and anti-Semitic program and commitment to violence. This was not the main reason for its success, however. The rise of Hamas was part of a regional trend that represented a response to what many perceived as the bankruptcy of the secular nationalist ideologies that had dominated politics in the Middle East for most of the 20th century. In the wake of the PLO's shift away from armed struggle and toward a diplomatic path meant to lead to a Palestinian state that failed to achieve results, many Palestinians felt that the organization had lost its way, and Hamas grew in consequence, despite its extremely conservative social positions and the sketchy outline of the future it proposed. So the Palestinians preferred some kind of action to what they had seen in the stalemate and the weakness of the Palestinian Authority, formerly the PLO. One of the few surviving members of the old guard of the Fatah Central Committee that had long dominated the PLO, Abbas, and now he's talking about President Abbas, Abu Mazen. Abbas was this is the way that Professor Khalidi does this. It almost seems polite, but it's a very big takedown of President Abbas. Abbas was neither charismatic nor eloquent. He was not renowned for personal bravery or considered a man of the people. Overall, he was one of the least impressive of the early generation of prominent Fatah leaders. And it's mentioned later in the book, but Israel doesn't bother to assassinate the people who are incompetent. So the 2006 election, against all expectations, including its own, Hamas won the elections by a handsome margin. It took 74 seats to Fatah's 45 in a 132-member assembly, although with the peculiarities of the electoral system, it had won only 44% of the vote to Fatah's 41%. Exit polls after the vote showed that the result owed more to the voters' great desire for change in the occupied territories than to a call for Islamist government or heightened armed resistance to Israel. Even in some predominantly Christian neighborhoods, the vote went heavily for Hamas. This is evidence that many voters simply wanted to throw out the Fatah incumbents whose strategy had failed and who were seen as corrupt and unresponsive to popular demands. Under this pressure from below, Hamas and Fatah repeatedly tried to form a coalition government of members of both parties. These efforts ran into fierce opposition from Israel and the United States. We can't have a unified Palestinian people, Palestinian government, that would be dangerous, which rejected Hamas as part of any PA government. They insisted on explicit recognition of Israel, rather than the implicit form embodied in the prisoner's document. Sorry, I should have mentioned the prisoner's document was put together by leaders of different coalitions of the Palestinian resistance, as well as a variety of other conditions. Thus, Hamas was now drawn into the same interminable dance around concessions that the PLO had been forced to endure for decades. Whether the demand was that it amend its charter, agree to UN Resolution 242, renounce terrorism, or accept Israel's existence, all to gain legitimation by those imposing the conditions. Whether the demands were made of the PLO in the 1970s or Hamas in the 2000s, they were required without the offer of any quid pro quo by the power that had expelled much of the Palestinian people, blocked their return, occupied their territory through force and collective intimidation, and prevented their self-determination. Meanwhile, under the USA Patriot Act of 2001, material support for terrorism was so broadly defined in the Palestinian case that almost any contact with an organization or associated with a group that was placed on the blacklist, as Hamas and the PFLP were, could be considered a serious criminal act involving heavy penalties. The demonization of the PLO over the decades since the 1960s was now repeated with Hamas. Yet even with the suicide bombings, with targeting civilians in violation of international law, and with the crude anti-Semitism of its charter, Hamas's record paled next to the massive toll of Palestinian civilian casualties inflicted by Israel and its elaborate structures of legal discrimination and military rule. But it was Hamas that was stuck with the terrorist label, and the weight of the U.S. law was applied to the Palestinian side of the conflict alone. This is a 2014 attack on Gaza, which was disproportionate and indiscriminate and murderous. Specific details of the 2014 assault underline this point. Over a period of 51 days in July and August of 2014, Israel's Air Force launched more than 6,000 air attacks, while its Army and Navy fired about 50,000 artillery and tank shells. Together, they utilized what has been estimated as a total of 21 kilotons. That's 21,000 tons. 42 million pounds of high explosives. The air assault involved weapons ranging from armed drones and American Apache helicopters firing U.S.-made Hellfire missiles to American F-16 and F-15 fighter bombers carrying 2,000-pound bombs. According to the commander of the Israeli Air Force, There were several hundred attacks by such advanced aircraft on targets in Gaza, most of them using these powerful bombs. The explosion of a 2,000-pound bomb produces a crater that is roughly 50 feet wide and 36 feet deep and sends lethal fragments to a radius of almost a quarter mile. One or two such bombs can destroy an entire multi-story building, many of which were leveled in Gaza City toward the conclusion of the Israeli air campaign at the end of August. There is no public record of exactly how many of these monsters were dropped on the Gaza Strip, or whether even heavier ordnance was used. These are not precision munitions. These are murderous bombs that are just meant to kill everything around. A senior Pentagon official with access to the daily briefings called the scale of firepower massive and deadly, noting that the U.S. Army would normally use so huge an amount of shell fire in support of two entire divisions comprising 40,000 troops. Another, a former American artillery commander, estimated that the U.S. military would employ that number of guns only in support of an Army corps of several divisions. A retired American general described the Israeli bombardment used to pound one Gaza neighborhood for over 24 hours, along with tank fire and attacks from the air, as absolutely disproportionate. Now, where does this strategy come from? It comes from 2008. Was explained by Major General Gadi Eisenkot, then head of Northern Command, and he was later Israeli Chief of Staff. What happened in the Dahia quarter will happen in every village from which Israel is fired on. You throw a rock, we're going to shoot you. We will apply disproportionate force on it and cause great damage and destruction there. From our standpoint, these are not civilian villages, they are military bases. This is not a recommendation, this is a plan, and it has been approved. It could be argued that this permissive American attitude toward Israel's behavior, occasionally masked by declaratory opposition to specific measures, which rarely change the situation on the ground, endangers U.S. interests in the Middle East, given the widespread support for the Palestinians by the populations of the Arab world. But the Middle East has for years been ruled by the largest concentration of autocratic regimes of any region in the world. Moreover, the United States has never supported the advance of democracy in the Middle East in any sustained way, preferring to deal with the dictatorships and absolute monarchies that control most countries. These undemocratic regimes have historically been subservient to the United States and valuable clients of its defense, aerospace, oil, banking, and real estate industries. They have generally acted in defiance of their own pro-Palestinian public opinion, thus immunizing Washington from any blowback for its support of Israel's occupation and colonization of Palestine. Although Obama had indicated that the Palestinian issue was a priority for his administration, his response to the wars on Gaza was a truer measure of his engagement. The first of them that took place on his watch began after his election, but before he was inaugurated. At no point then or subsequently did the president seek to disturb the false narrative whereby what was underway in the Gaza Strip during these ferocious onslaughts was a righteous response to terrorist rocket fire aimed at Israeli civilians. At no point did his administration interrupt the flow of American weapons that were used to kill some 3,000 Palestinian civilians and maim many more. Indeed, deliveries were accelerated when Israel deemed that necessary. At no point did Obama decisively confront Israel over its siege of the Gaza Strip. Conclusions. Yet, for all its might, its nuclear weapons, and its alliance with the United States, today the Jewish state is at least as contested globally as it was at any time in the past. The Palestinians' resistance, their persistence, and their challenge to Israel's ambitions are among the most striking phenomena of the current era. And I have to say, even when you read about all these horrors, you almost can't believe that the Palestinians continue to hold on. It's so brave, it's so heroic, it's so admirable, and it, at least for someone like myself, it inspires me to keep learning and to try to support them whenever possible. With the establishment of Israel, Zionism did succeed in fashioning a potent national movement and a thriving new people in Palestine, but it could not fully supplant the country's original population, which is what would have been necessary for the ultimate triumph of Zionism. Settler colonial confrontations with indigenous peoples have only ended in one of three ways: with the elimination or full subjugation of the native population, as in North America, with the defeat and expulsion of the colonizer, as in Algeria, which is extremely rare, or with the abandonment of colonial supremacy in the context of compromise and reconciliation, as in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Ireland. This is from a Likud member, Miki Zohar, who's in the Knesset, or was in the Knesset at this time. The Palestinian, he said, does not have the right of self-determination because he is not the proprietor of the land. I want him as a resident because of my honesty. As he was born here, he lives here, and I would never tell him to leave. I regret to say it, but they suffer from one major defect. They were not born Jews. Oh, goodness. You can't make this stuff up. And this is a final conclusion, which I am totally on board with, and I had not thought through the implications before reading this in the conclusion, but I am totally convinced by it. One key change that is needed involves acknowledging that the diplomatic strategy adopted by the PLO since the 1980s was fatally flawed. The United States is not and cannot be a mediator, a broker, or a neutral party. It has long opposed Palestinian national aspirations and has formally committed itself to support the Israeli government's positions on Palestine. The Palestinian national movement must recognize the true nature of the American stance and undertake dedicated grassroots political and informational work to make its case inside the United States. As a superpower, it would necessarily be represented at any talks, but it should be considered as an adversarial party, even seated with Israel on the opposite side of the table, which would represent its real position, at least since 1967. So, as I say, this is my new recommendation for a lengthier one volume. So it's about 300 pages, as I say, with the endnotes. If you don't want to recommend the very short introduction by Martin Bunton, which is only about 120 pages, I think it's excellent. Obviously, it comes from a Palestinian point of view. So I'm not trying to say that he also includes the Israeli perspective, which is obviously going to have its own differing points. And we are going to read those books this year. So it is from the Palestinian perspective, but since we've only ever really heard the Zionist perspective in the mainstream media, I always tell people I don't have as much of a need to hear the Zionist perspective because I've been hearing it my whole life in a certain sense. Most of us have not heard the Palestinian perspective, so this is a great opportunity to do so. If you like this review, go back and check out part 1 of the review. If you've already done that, hit like, subscribe, share this with friends, send a super thanks if you'd like to thank me for the work. If you'd like to support the work even more than a super thanks, you can join the Patreon or the YouTube members, and you'll get early releases to videos like this. You also have a chance to nominate or even sponsor videos. If you'd like, you can also pick a book from my Amazon wish list to nominate it, probably at this point for 2025, because most of 2024 is already booked up with Israel and Palestine. And a reminder that a portion of all the proceeds from the different channels are going to go this year in 2024 to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which has been established for many years to help Palestinian children who otherwise couldn't get medical care to get medical care. And I'm so grateful for what they're doing. And if you want to contribute to them directly, feel free. If you want to contribute indirectly by supporting the channel, of course, I appreciate that. As always, enjoy your reading.